right. Well, I'm gonna then go ahead and call
Please
the
do.
Planning, Zoning, and Housing Committee meeting to order on March 13th. It's 7:02. Thank you all for being so prompt with getting here. We do have a couple special guests tonight. We have Francis Pickering, who is the Executive Director of WestCog. He's going to tell you a little bit about what WestCog is, and then also give us some updates on what's been happening up in Hartford. And then at the end of the meeting, Frank Kemp from TGS&A is going to talk to us a little bit about what the project they've been working on with amending the Appendix B to the charter, which describes what each of our committees do. So with that, maybe Francis, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and give us a little background first on what it is that you do and what WestCog is. I think some of the folks in this committee have been involved with this with planning and zoning or with the RTM for a while and maybe have a little more familiarity, but there's some folks that are pretty new. So probably best that you don't assume too much knowledge and dumb it down for us a little bit if you can.
Okay, well, I won't dumb it down because I know Darien has a lot of human capital. So yes, I'm the executive director of WestCog. I've been there since we started in 2015. We are one of 9 regional councils of governments in Connecticut, which are established pursuant to state law. And as I'm sure all of you are familiar, especially benchmarking yourself against Westchester County, we do not have county government in Connecticut, have not had it since 1960. But when county government was abolished, there was a recognition that municipalities have many shared concerns and interests, and that we can be stronger together than alone. And so WestCog comprises 18 municipalities running from Greenwich through Westport and north to New Milford and Newtown. And our board comprises the 18 chief elected officials, the mayors and first selectmen of the region. We meet on a monthly basis to discuss, as I said, matters of shared interest and concern. We have about 16 employees. Our office is in Sandy Hook. And what we do for the region is manifold. Our primary function is to coordinate transportation planning throughout the region and with neighboring regions to ensure that federal transportation investments have full community support and represent an efficient use of federal funds. We want to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. And if you look around the state of Connecticut, you're probably familiar with some of the stub highways we have. Those were largely built before there was a regional transportation planning process where we actually saw highway revolts, where we saw projects initiated that didn't have community support and eventually foundered due to the lack of support and resulting opposition. We are also involved in several other roles. We host a federally designated economic development district, which coordinates economic development within the region and with our partners in the state of Connecticut to help foster high quality of life and a thriving economy, and to ensure that we are working in the same direction and not merely poaching business from each other, that it's not a zero-sum game. With respect to land use, which is probably your greatest interest, and housing, under state law, the regional councils of governments are required to carry out what are called land use referrals. So anytime a municipality proposes amending its municipal plan of conservation and development, its subdivision or zoning text or zoning map, and that potentially could have an intermunicipal impact, that must be referred to WestCog staff for an advisory opinion. So we do see your land use proposals, not applications, but proposals to amend your regulations and your map. The WestCog board directs the staff to address issues of concern, as I said, and one issue that has risen to the fore in the last several years has been housing affordability and efforts at various levels to address that. And about 5 years ago, with the advent of the pandemic and the explosion in real estate values, our board and our planning and zoning commissioners gave us the direction to engage more with our legislators in Hartford to educate them about um, the real estate market, housing need and demand in southwestern Connecticut, and provide them with feedback on proposals and policy tools to ensure that our real estate market meets the needs of our residents, and also that state policy is productive and not counterproductive. So I'm happy to answer any questions about that overview, if there are any.
So yeah, so does anyone have any questions about WestCog or its role in um, coordination with Darien? No.
Sorry.
Yeah, Priscilla?
Remind me again how it came to be formed and who put it together? Was it just the regions or did the state government
Um, so the councils of governments, it's a long history. At the same time, county government was eliminated. The state conducted a study to identify logical planning regions. That was in around 1960. And that resulted in 15 planning regions, each of which had a respective regional planning agency. Uh, those agencies had boards, they had a complex board structure, but they didn't have the chief elected officials on them. Over the course of the years between around 1960 and 2013, the regional planning agencies began to become vehicles to address additional functions. So federal transportation planning, federal economic development, environmental projects, data and analysis, emergency management. And as these responsibilities accrued, some of the regions began to change their organizational form from regional planning agencies, which are basically appointed boards, to elected boards. So there was a migration to the councils of governments. I previously worked at a regional planning agency in central Connecticut that no longer exists. In the early 2010s, a decision was made by the General Assembly that the council of government structure was preferable to the regional planning agency structure because it directly had the chief elected official of every municipality on the board. So we knew we had buy-in, we had a direct line of communication. When somebody's elected to be CEO, they're also elected to sit on the COG board. So it's democratically accountable as opposed to an appointed board. In southwestern Connecticut, previous to West COG, there were two agencies which you may be familiar: the Southwest Regional Planning Agency, based in Stamford, and the Housatonic Valley Council of Elected Officials, based in Brookfield. In 2013, the state essentially gave notice to the regions that they would like to reduce the number of regions, and that launched a process where municipalities and regions were able to choose their alignments. And what emerged out of that was several realignments across the state. The most relevant to you is the merger of HVCEO and SWRPA. And that was consummated in 2015.
Okay. Oh, I didn't know that history. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sorry, go on.
Excuse me. I was going to ask, how is it funded? How are
That's
the
a good
various
question.
COGs funded?
Yeah, so we operate like we are largely grant funded. If you look at our budget, we collect municipal dues from every municipality in the region. Our dues are set by our board every year. And the dues, for our largest grants, the dues are matched. For every one local dollar we bring in 9 federal and state dollars together. So the dues are the seed money, which enable us to operate all the programs that we do for the region. And then on top of that, we also pursue discretionary grants. So if you do look at our budget from year to year, over the last several years, with the renewed emphasis on infrastructure funding at the federal level, our budget has really accelerated with a lot of additional federal resources coming in.
So no elected officials. So everybody that works in West Cog applies for the job to whom?
The board is all elected
Board
officials.
is all
The board
elected.
is all
It is
elected
all
officials.
elected. I thought you said it
Yes.
wasn't elected.
No,
It's
sorry.
all the,
If
it's all the
there's any
mayors and
confusion.
first selectmen, correct, Francis?
Yes. Yep.
Yes.
Previously, the predecessor organizations were appointed, they were not elected. But the councils of governments, when somebody is elected to become a mayor or first selectman, they are automatically have a seat on the COG.
Okay.
So John Zagrodzky is
Mhm.
Gotcha.
part of the board.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Dan,
Sure.
question?
Yeah, I was just curious. You had said that any change in land use um, gets a look over by Westcog, and then is that state mandated? Is that how is that? What is that process? Where did that come about?
That's a statutory process, so it is state mandated. And essentially your planner will send, so Jeremy will email us any applicable proposal in advance, and it's a staff review. And the primary consideration is whether the proposal is in conflict with or not in conflict with the regional plan of conservation and development. However, from time to time, we also do provide additional comments. So in the past, we provide comments, for instance, to other municipalities that um, their proposal may have some conflicts with federal or state law, and they may want to have the corporation council review that. It's basically a look over. It's advisory only, so we cannot veto anything, but it's a service we provide.
And it is when there's the comments from Westcog are typically read into the record at the Planning and Zoning Commission level before they decide on an application as part of the comments that they receive. What is your involvement with the POCD process? I mean, we're in the middle of going through that now in Darien, or starting that.
So some municipalities have invited the COG to be a participant early on in the plan of conservation development. So for instance, Stamford is going through a planning process. Excuse me, and their consultants sat down with us and met to discuss the regional perspective on Stamford's plan. But that's optional. We're available to provide input and analysis to municipalities, resources permitting, earlier in the planning process. But under state law, our only responsibility is to review the plan once a draft has been prepared, and then provide comments back to the municipality. And we just did that for the town of New Canaan.
Got it. Okay. All right. Any other questions, or would we like to sort of move on to discussion of what's happening at the state level? Nope. All right. So
Great. Well,
what can you tell us about what's happening? There seems to be a lot.
Well, I'm just going to frame things a little bit. So Westcog has taken an active role in helping municipalities with housing. A couple of years ago, we undertook a regional affordable housing toolkit, which served as the basis or as the plan, the 8-30J plan for 10 municipalities in the region. Subsequent to that, just this last year, we released affordable housing finance strategy, looking at opportunities for the market without public subsidy to create affordable housing in the region. Over the last several years, I have been very engaged representing the region up in Hartford, and we have seen a flurry of housing activity. You're probably familiar with some of the bills. Unfortunately, this year we've not had a chance to send out as many action alerts, but I know CCM and Cost are doing that. We have also been swamped with developments at the federal level since January 20th. But I can give you an overview. So it's been a strange year. The last 4 or 5 years, we've seen housing desires and housing policy telegraphed far out in advance, right? There have been advocacy groups who said do X, Y, Z. There has been rallying behind certain policies. This year, we haven't seen that. It's really been flying under the radar, which is a little bit challenging because we have to monitor things ourselves. And I've heard from chief elected officials, from legislators, from advocates that they've really been astonished at the flood of activity that's been happening. So to date, I have submitted testimony on approximately 85 bills to the General Assembly.
Jesus.
And that testimony is available on the respective pages for each hearing. Initially, I was enthused because what we've seen since 2020 is really a laser-like focus on municipal responsibility for affordable housing, specifically zoning, right? The changes to municipal plans, and zoning regulations have been highlighted as a solution to housing affordability challenges. The problem with that is that, as we all know, there are many cost drivers in housing. And if you are seeking to diet, shrinking one slice of the pie won't go very far. You need to shrink all slices of the pie. So over the last several years, we've been seeking to help the legislature solve this problem by directing attention to the factors that really drive housing cost. And then when you look at information provided by the National Association of Home Builders, much, if not all, of the increase in housing cost over the last several, say, 15 or so years has been driven by increases in construction cost, and more recently, financing cost. So the cost of materials and labor has really exploded. I was just on a call with some builders discussing that, and unfortunately, we haven't seen much conversation at the state level. We've largely seen a focus on local zoning commissions. The problem, of course, is if you don't correctly identify the problem, you're not going to most likely get to the right solution. So if we try to solve housing affordability solely on the back of zoning, we're not going to address lending costs, materials costs, labor costs, state regulatory burden. Instead, we'll see the housing remains expensive, and municipalities may end up getting faulted despite all their good efforts because they, frankly, addressing zoning isn't enough. So here's where we are this session. And I do have a list of bills I can send out afterwards if there's interest, or I could share my screen. It's quite a long list, several dozen. There are some good bills. So we've seen, as I mentioned before, the focus has largely been on zoning. The last 2 or 3 years, we've really said you need to be holistic and look at all slices of the pie. We're finally seeing all attention given to almost all slices of the pie. We've seen a number of bills, approximately 10 bills on construction costs, a couple of bills looking at lowering barriers to bringing more people into our construction workforce, which has yet to recover from the Great Recession. We still are below 2007 levels. We've seen proposals for tax credits and tax reductions for adaptive reuse of commercial buildings, for building materials to be used in affordable housing. We've seen proposals to reduce or waive the conveyance tax for affordable housing, to provide state funding for infrastructure that whose costs you can't recoup right now because Connecticut does not provide for impact fees. We've seen programs to fund talent development pipelines and to build affordable housing itself. Those we would all consider good bills. We also know that housing affordability issues are also household income challenges, and those can be addressed through either higher incomes or income supports. So we have seen proposals to increase the number and flexibility of state housing vouchers to provide additional flexibility in income levels in rent. We've also seen on the home ownership side bills to look at how can we promote more affordable home ownership. Can we make some changes to the property tax? Can we provide benefits for first-time homeowners? All of these are, when I say they're good bills, they're bills that do not have a negative fiscal note attached to them with respect to municipalities. So they don't entail additional costs for municipalities. They don't also entail any erosion of local control. Many of them actually provide local options that municipalities can take advantage of if those make sense in their environment and in their local housing market. We've seen a couple of bills to undertake 8-30G reform. So the governor's introduced Bill 1252, which would reduce the threshold necessary to qualify for a moratorium if a municipality adopts certain modest zoning changes. We've also seen a couple of bills to expand the housing that is considered under 830G to have more naturally occurring affordable housing. So it's a variety of these bills, these good bills, unfortunately, many of them had hearings later in the process, the last couple of weeks. They have not yet made it out of committee. As you may be aware, the General Assembly is subdivided into many committees. Usually housing bills go through the Housing Committee or Planning Development Committee. This year, some of these other bills are going through banking, finance, revenue and bonding, appropriations, commerce. We're seeing, because we're seeing more housing issues addressed, they're spreading out into more committees. There's a range of bills that are neutral. There are a couple of bills that have a dozen or more sponsors. That's Bill 12 and 5002. We expect those to be omnibus housing bills. They are passing out of committee with almost no language at all. So they're really placeholder bills. So they could be good or they could be very concerning. We don't know what's going to be in them. Then there's a range of bills that make some incremental changes that I don't think anybody would have too much disagreement with, such as updating statistics, changing maps, improving definitions, providing state grants. Relatively innocuous bills that might represent marginal, still important improvements. And then there's the list of bad bills, which I'm sure people want to hear about, because those are the ones that we will unfortunately have to devote most of our time to addressing, either seeking to improve them so they do meet local housing needs and serve municipalities, or to arrest them so they don't make it to the finish line. I'm going to go through these. Bill 7036 would mandate fair rent commissions in every municipality. Fair rent commissions are essentially local quasi-judicial instances that municipalities must find volunteers for and staff with adequate legal counsel, and they can intervene in tenant-landlord disputes and revise private party contracts, intervene and revise those contracts. So that does create significant exposure for municipalities. 1267 would enable local public housing authorities unilaterally to expand into other municipalities. So whether or not the receiving municipality wants it, we have nothing against housing authorities, but current state law allows expansion bilaterally or regional housing authorities. It's not clear why this is needed. 1444 would require municipalities to allow the by right conversion of any commercial property to multifamily. So this could be a gas station, it could be a brownfield, and unlike 830G, a municipality could not condition this on health or safety. So there are some significant concerns about allowing any commercial properties to be adaptively reused as housing. 7062 is brought back from last year. It would enable any religious organization to put up what are called temporary shelter units on their property, essentially small shacks that homeless persons or refugees could live in. And it would also give religious organizations by right ability to put up affordable housing on their properties. There are some provisions for municipal authority under this, but they are exceedingly limited and really could result in a chaotic situation. We are also concerned that limiting this by right ability to religious organizations may run afoul of the Constitution.
That's I just want to interject there. As a real
Yeah.
estate agent, it's interesting. I've gotten a few calls from other
Mhm.
agents looking for religious structures to come to Darien, which I find very strange that all of a sudden there's these new religions that want to move to our town and are looking for locations. Do you think that has anything to do with this bill?
I can't say. What I can say we have seen is that, across the country, there are a number of congregations that are, their members are essentially aging out, and we see properties coming on the market. And in some cases, developers do buy those. Many of them are in residential zones. Sometimes they do go 830G. They have every right to do so under state law. This is a bit of the reverse, right? This is not a developer coming in to convert a church or a temple into housing. This is a church or a temple or other house of worship putting housing on their property. So I'm not sure how many congregations would want to do this. The concern is that religious organization is a very expansive term. Well, it's not as expansive to include nonprofit housing providers, but it could include any type of, say, I don't want to judge religions, but if the Pastafarians came into Darien, right, they you can't discriminate against them as a religion, right? So they could put something like this up. Monday, this coming Monday, Planning Development's hearing 6249, which would carve out in the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act, which is a mini NEPA, which would dramatically limit the ability of people to intervene on housing applications. So right now, essentially anybody can intervene on environmental grounds on any project. This would limit on housing projects interveners to either nonprofit organizations or neighbors within 100 feet. So somebody down the street who would be impacted by traffic, or down a stream who would be impacted by potential water quality or quantity issues would not be able to intervene, nor would the municipality. So Darien would lose that right to intervene under SEPA on housing projects. 7061 would eliminate the ability of zoning commissions to set minimum parking requirements for any type of development anywhere in the state. So this is not just looking at housing. This could also be commercial and industrial property. So for instance, for a shopping mall, you could not impose a minimum parking requirement. 7112 just came out of committee. The language has changed. There was a lot to like in the original bill. I guess after the hearing and all the positive feedback, that got pulled out, and instead things we don't like got put in. That bill would limit the maximum minimum lot size a municipality could set to 1 acre, so less than what is required under the public health code for areas that are on private well and septic. And it would also give developers the right to extend municipal sewer systems themselves. So we're not talking about a developer paying for an extension. We're talking about the developer actually building an extension to the sewer system, and it's not clear a municipality would be able to stop that. So they would essentially lose control of their sewer systems. Bill 1313 would mandate upzoning around all train and bus rapid transit stations. Basically, this would allow, our estimates are housing for an additional 750,000 people statewide around the 62 or so train and bus rapid transit stations we have. This would pretty significantly impact Darien, given the stations you have and the ones we're close to across town lines. 7113 is a bill that appears to be permissible for what's called light touch density, which is a proposal from the American Enterprise Institute. But when you read the language, we can't tell if this is a drafting error or it's intentional, but it essentially would require municipalities to allow by right middle housing in many, many places. So up to 4 plexes. And then last and definitely not least, we have 6944, which is the fair share bill. So in previous years, we had seen the Open Communities Alliance, which is a housing advocacy group, come out and push a highly controversial policy called fair share, modeled on New Jersey, but no state has actually done what they are proposing. Under this year's proposal, any municipality, all but the 20% poorest municipalities in the state would have to do a priority affordable housing plan. That plan would have to be submitted to OPM. The municipality would have to rezone following that plan. Any subsequent zoning amendments would have to go up to OPM for approval. And the zoning amendments would also all have to be published in the Connecticut Law Journal. And this would give housing advocacy organizations extraordinary standing to sue both the state and municipalities for a variety of perceived wrongs. The actual housing targets or allocations that each municipality would have to zone for are as yet unknown. Those are currently being determined by consultants Eco Northwest out of Oregon. They gave a presentation back in January, which I attended. They're having another presentation this coming Thursday on regional and local housing allocations. Their presentation last in January found that the state, well, depending on how you characterize it, they found a gap of approximately 360,000 housing units statewide. So about as much housing you need for 900,000 additional residents. We aren't quite sure why we would need housing for 900,000 people, because that would be nearly an unprecedented growth rate. But much of their argument was based on the fact that many households in Connecticut pay less for housing than the housing economists would predict. So the solution to that is to build more expensive housing so people can upgrade to that more expensive housing that is at the correct price point for their income. And those are the bills. So I'm happy to go back and talk about any of the bills. I know it was a lot to lay out, or any of the concepts.
Francis, do you mind? Can you just tell me what the second one was? I missed. That's the one that I missed.
The second in the entire list, or towards
Yeah,
the end?
yeah, and the entire list. We did 7, 3, 5, 6 was the first one, and then what was that second one?
Which one was that on? The first one was 7036, mandates fair rent commissions.
Okay.
1267 was
12.
housing authority expansion unilaterally.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. So, I kind of worked our way what we consider to be from the least to the most alarming of the bad, with 6944 being the most alarming of the bad. We would anticipate that leading to a litigation explosion where a much milder form of fair share was practiced in New Jersey. It arose out of a court challenge, the Mount Laurel decision in 1975, based on the New Jersey Constitution, which is different than ours. That has essentially resulted in decades of almost unbroken litigation. And we would expect that to occur in Connecticut.
Gotcha.
And our estimates from last year, for last year's version of fair share, this one's a bit different. We don't know what the numbers are, but our estimates were they would probably result in a 20% increase in property taxes statewide.
Who's proposing all these bills?
Well, that's hard to say, because in the way the General Assembly works, we're in the long session, right? We have long and short sessions. And the long session is when we can, in the short session, which is next year and every 2 years after that, we address budget issues, kind of a true up of the budget. In the long session, we address anything of interest to legislators. And when you look at the bills, sometimes they are introduced by one or more sponsors and co-sponsors. Sometimes they are introduced by the committee. So for many of these bills, there are no fingerprints on who this came from. Now, we know from lobbying in previous years, the language under 6944, parts of it are almost verbatim from previous fair share bills. That's from the Open Communities Alliance. Where that came from, I think they made it up themselves, because no other state has done that. Some of these other ones, such as the elimination of parking requirements everywhere for every type of development, which is really breathtaking. I can't tell you where that came from. I've never heard of anything like that anywhere else in the country.
That's 7061 bill?
Yes, that's 7061. Mm-hmm.
And you're going to send around this list afterwards?
Yes, I will send. I
thank
just went through it earlier today. So what happens if you do go to, I will have links in the list too, and I type it all up. You can track these bills at the General Assembly's website, www.cga.ct.us. You can easily put the number at the bottom. You can also sign up for a bill tracker that will email and or text you when there's a status change to the bill. In the General Assembly, things are introduced in committee, and then there's a decision to draft it and then to bring it to a hearing. And anything can die at any point, right? And if you look at how a bill becomes law, it stopped anywhere. So what we're looking at right now is we're coming to the end of March, where the deadlines for committees are to basically move bills out of committee. So if we get to the end of March and a bill has not left the committee, it's almost certain that bill is dead for the session. That doesn't mean the concepts can't reappear somewhere else, but that bill itself is dead as a vehicle. When a bill comes out of committee, there are two options. It can be either JF'd, which is joint favorable, which means it just passed out of committee with no changes. or it could be JFS, which is joint favorable substitute, where they've changed the language. That language you will not find on the bill page generally. You have to go to the original committee and go into a different page, which is proposed substitute language, and look for that in there. It can be hard to find. I will try to add links for that. Where we are right now is bills. We don't know what the trajectory of bills are because some are coming out. Some just take longer to come out, but by April 1st or so, we should know what's out there. Once things are out there, there'll be a lull. The session ends in early June, I think June 4th. And it's usually a mad dash at the end. The challenge is that the way the General Assembly operates, much of the most consequential legislation doesn't emerge as a freestanding bill. It gets slipped into a so-called omnibus bill, such as a bonding bill or a budget implementer, with a million other provisions. These bills can be 500, 1,000 pages long. They're often released with maybe a day's notice before they're voted on. So your bill tracker will not show you if the language you like or dislike reemerges or some other language reemerges somewhere else. So if you have spare time, it definitely pays to monitor what is going on the General Assembly's website.
But I guess, and I've been trying to do that myself, but then it's also hard because, like you said, a lot of these bills, when it's the time for the public hearing and public comment, you don't actually have a bill yet. You have a placeholder language.
Yeah, so there are a couple ways this has. Sometimes you have fully fleshed out language. So with the bill I mentioned, which one was it? 7112, all the good language got swapped out after the hearing, right? With 12 and 5002, it was a placeholder, so we don't actually know what it's going to do. We just have a statement of intent. And then so that's more of a placeholder bill. There are also dummy bills. If you go into the General Assembly and you see a hearing on a bill that changes no later than to within 30 days, or changes a comma to a semicolon or something like that, those are dummy bills. That's not the actual language. Those are preserved as vehicles to slip something else into later on in the session. And some people dislike those. Some people say it's a fact of life. We need to maintain flexibility during the session. They do this because the way the session operates, you can't rewind back into a hearing. Once the hearings are closed, you can't reopen the hearing process.
But how do you comment on, like, for example, the one that you talked about where it totally changed the language? How does anyone comment on it now that it's out of committee?
There's no opportunity for formal public comment on those, which is frustrating. The best way to address those is to talk to your legislators and tell them the language you either support or oppose.
Got it. So when you say you've submitted 80 some odd comments, that's in the public hearing process, and now we're in a period of working with our local representatives.
Yeah, so the public hearing process is in some legislatures, what you see is before you get to bills, you'll actually have a commission on something, right? And you'll have a number of experts and residents, citizens, et cetera, commenting, and then that gets into a bill. The public hearing process in Connecticut often is a way to collect that information, but there's no hearing afterwards, right? If everybody comes in and says, change this, or nobody says anything that changes afterwards, you can't actually circle back during the session to address that. So it does leave something to be desired from a public involvement standpoint.
Do you feel like you're able to sort of give us a little bit of a crystal ball as to what you see might pass or not pass out of all of this?
I don't have any more insight than the legislators do. And right now, even leadership does not know, from what I've heard, right, in their conversations, does not know what's going to pass. Obviously, we are in a lot of flux with the federal government in the state of economy, and that could decisively change things. My personal take is, given how much is moving right now, we might want to hunker down and not change too much, right? There are too many variables in play, so maybe we should just focus on maintaining stability at the state and local level for the time being until we see how it all shakes out nationally. But I don't know if the legislature is going to have the same thinking on that. So I don't know where it's going to go. We did hear that Work Live Ride, which is the desegregate CT bill, passed out of committee. I haven't reviewed the amended JFS language. Some people consider that a bad bill. I consider it a redundant bill since we already have the Municipal Redevelopment Authority, which basically does the same thing, only with money. I have heard that this is the year that that's going to pass. I don't know why that would be, except that they've, if first you don't succeed, try again. But I don't think legislation should work that way. I mean, the best bill should pass, not the bills that people just keep coming back for every year. So that bill might pass. Some of the other bills, I think there's going to be a fight over fair share. So just for timeline, as I mentioned, legislative sessions over first week of June. The final numbers for fair share we expect to have in May. So that's not a lot of time to understand what they mean for municipalities.
Mhm. Got it.
And when we look at some of the other bills, I'm sure you have all seen this. I'm sure your Board of Finance has seen this. For state legislators, when a bill moves through the process, it gets to a point where there's a review by the Office of Legislative Research and then the Office of Fiscal Analysis. The Office of Fiscal Analysis will cost out what the impacts of a bill are, but costing is very, very high level, and it largely focuses on fiscal impacts to the state. So a bill that has impacts to municipalities, especially if they're like tertiary or quaternary impacts, right? Like we're going to push a zoning change onto you. Down the road, that's going to have an impact on the development you see in your town, maybe the demand for services or your property tax revenues. Then down the road, that's going to make you have to adjust your mill rate. That's not actually captured by OFA. So we often see a lot of so-called unfunded mandates where the state says, well, we'd love to do something, but it's going to cost us money, so we'll just push it onto the towns.
Well, and it also doesn't incorporate, to the extent some of the things that you've talked about require a lot of additional work and reporting by the town, the expense of having the staff on the town level to do all of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the fair rent commissions, for instance, I could not advise anybody to set one of those up without having a housing lawyer on staff to attend those meetings. That, we are not opposing that because it can be done at the regional level, and we think some of these unfunded mandates I don't want to say use the COG as a dumping ground for these,
Mhm.
but some of these things, if they are going to happen, it might be best to situate it at the COG because we can potentially achieve some economies of scale rather than having every single municipality hire their own housing attorney.
Yeah, I can't see Darien doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone have any questions about any of the specific bills or otherwise? Cindy?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, could you talk a little bit more about the 1313 bill?
So that's an interesting bill because it's not the first time we've seen it. Sometimes like zombie movies, these things that we think die keep coming back to life. And I will just pull up my notes on that right now. This is actually a bill that was introduced several years ago. It was the first desegregate bill. And it died because it was just, well, I can't tell you why, but let me kind of go through what it would do. So it would require um, within 1/2 mile of every passenger rail or bus rapid transit station, of which there are 63 in the state, municipalities to zone for a minimum of 15 dwelling units per acre. Now, it's not actually 15 dwelling units on a parcel by parcel basis. It's an average of 15 per acre, which is a really strange concept because somebody could go in and put a 75-story tower in and consume all the units. This could occasion a land rush, right? It's 15 per acre averaged across the entire area. So there is a risk that it would create a land rush where whoever builds first gets the units. Half a mile works out to 502 acres around every train or bus rapid transit station. And based upon our analysis and talking to other towns, we estimate that about 35% of the land would be exempt from this rezoning because it's rights of way or it's unbuildable. So that would work out to, if you multiply it all out, 307,125 housing units statewide. And let me just do the math right now, or 4,875 housing units around each of your train stations. Note that this does not cut off at municipal boundaries. So if you have a train station just across the line, say in Stamford or New Canaan or Norwalk, you would fall within that buffer. So in the last decade, 2010 to 2020, Connecticut grew up 0.9%. This bill, assuming household sizes stay the same, would mandate accommodating housing for over 767,000 new residents. So you're basically planning for the next 240 years of growth at current growth rates.
And with the way that Darien is situated, we've got railroad stations everywhere, but in other
Mhm.
parts of the state that have more land, they don't have the transportation. So they wouldn't, to the extent there's any benefit from any of these bills from growing housing, it would be harmful to those communities.
Yeah, and the bill does, if you look at the bill, some people say, well, we do consider environmental and build out constraints, but as you know, being a local commission, it's almost impossible to enumerate every limitation in advance. So when we looked at this, they say, well, if there's no public water and public sewer, more or less you're exempt. The problem, of course, is that just because you have water and sewer doesn't mean you have capacity and that you can add capacity. And we can't charge impact fees here in Connecticut. So a municipality would have to allow this, and presumably current taxpayers would have to absorb the cost of upgrades. And then, of course, there are other limitations, such as what if you're in an area with shallow groundwater, right? There's a potential range of build-out constraints that aren't enumerated here that one would not be excused from. So we came out strongly against, and there's also no consideration of the value of commercial industrial land, which is also important. So we came out strongly against this, saying that really zoning needs to be based on planning and not a one-size-fits-all prescription. 15 units per acre average at every single station across the state.
Thank you.
I don't know if that has legs, given that it died in previous years, and desegregate is no longer pushing that bill. So it may just have been introduced because somebody remembered it.
That's crazy. Jack, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is relevant to that, but I recall a number of years ago when Governor Malloy was here and he was trying to take over transportation sites from the municipalities. A Connecticut Supreme Court case that I believe came out of New London helped kill that. I think that was raised by a gentleman in Stanford by Barry Mickelson. So I don't know if that's part of the history of why this died 10 years ago.
It wasn't 10 years, about 5 years ago this died.
Okay.
And so, yes, there have been other proposals in the past. Pandemic, we had the so-called Transit Corridor Development Authority and then TCDAA, which we had opposed. And the premise of that was that the state owns a lot of land that is next to or near train stations, and that the state could redevelop that, and the state is exempt from local zoning. And we were very concerned about development that didn't follow any plan. I don't think the state has any appetite or capacity right now to do that. So in some areas, we have seen very impactful development that's gone through stationary development authorities we don't really have that structure here in Connecticut. And I haven't heard, there have been bills that haven't passed that would have directed various state agencies to comb through their property portfolios and identify parcels that could be redeveloped for affordable housing. That's just a really heavy lift. The state owns a lot of property, and to have agency staff who and agencies that have suffered attrition for years now to become potential real estate developers is just probably unrealistic. I think a better example is the town of Westport, where Westport approached the State Department of Transportation about getting access to a parcel that wasn't really being used for housing development. And I think the other thing that's changed too is we have seen a lot, the narrative sometimes in Hartford is that all the towns are digging their heels. They're not acting in good faith. But if people from Hartford come down to Darien and see what you've done in the Rowland Heights and see what's going on at the Corbin Collection, I think you've got some really fantastic examples of transit-oriented development whose stories aren't told often enough.
Right. And we're done under local control as opposed to because of any of these regulations.
Yeah, they were done under local control, and frankly, there's a that when we talk to the Department of Housing, we got some wonderful staff, and they are realists. They just want to get projects built. So one can bang one's head against a wall, or one can walk through a door, and the state agency employees are saying, if you're not ready to build, the town next to you is ready to build, and we'll go there because ultimately housing markets are regional, and we don't necessarily need to have something at every single station. So, for instance, we've talked about Talmadge Hill in New Canaan, could be a good location for some housing, but there's no infrastructure there. So it's really not viable. And we've also talked about, if you go to New Jersey, for instance, you'll see that there are certain stations like Metro Park that are largely, there's a park, some stations like Metro Park, Park and Ride, Secaucus Junction is a transfer station. Not every node in our state's transit system needs to be identical. Some are downtown, some are village centers, some are TOD, some are parking, and that diversity is actually a strength. So one thing we have pushed for, and now we have the support of the city of Stamford, is looking again. We studied this in the past about 12 years ago, pre-Westcog, looking at doing a Stamford East train station on the main line. I mean, there's been such powerful development in Stamford. Our expectation is if there were another mainline station in Stamford, that we'd probably see a lot of development that is locally supported take place there.
Where would that be in Stamford? I'm not sure I know what you're referencing.
That would be where the Toyota dealership is.
Oh, okay.
The corner of Myrtle Ave and East Main Street.
Yep. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. All right. Any other questions from anyone? No? All right. Well, this has been hugely helpful, Francis. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us, and I look forward to receiving the list so I can circulate that with everyone. And we appreciate that there is someone, keeping track of these. I don't think there's anyone in our town that could write 80 different letters in response to what's being proposed.
It's been a lot of work, but thank you so much for the invitation. I'm honored to be here, and anytime, just let me know.
Well, thank you. I
so much.
appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
It was
Francis.
very
you.
informative.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. With that, I will turn it over to Frank, and I guess, Jack, are you, the two of you both talking to us a little bit about Appendix B?
Yeah. I'm
Well,
not sure.
thank you.
Go ahead, Frank.
Thank you, Amy. As you might know, this process is coming to conclusion in the next couple of weeks. But during these couple of weeks, Jack and I have been visiting with each of the standing committees to collect their observations on the text, which is out there. You see it in sort of a double column format, where one column represents the text as it is in Muni Code and has been there for many years. And the text on the right-hand side is the draft that has been developed over the last couple of months through meetings with the TGSNA and input from various interests who have helped us. The text was submitted over to town council's office on the first edition, and we received some excellent edits from his team, and both in grammar and punctuation, and untangling some sentences that needed to be straightened out. That process is now continued. We submitted the current draft over to his office a couple of days ago so that he could do a preliminary review, so that when TGSNA meets in another 2 weeks, it can button the thing up and present it to rules, and then have it scheduled for the late April RTM meeting, where we'll all have a chance to look at it on the floor of the RTM. I know that Jack is eager to give us a little background on how this whole thing started. It's a good story, and I think you'll enjoy the background. And then we can just quickly then we can, at our own rate, walk through it. What you're looking at is 11 pages long. It has a couple of sections. The front part of it is rephrasing the existing material. Then the heart of it is the definition of the duties and responsibilities of the standing committees, and in statements in general that affect all the standing committees, and then it goes through the 7 descriptions, and then at the end some housekeeping, and then that's it. So Jack,
Okay, I'm going to take over from
take
here.
it away.
Okay. First, I want to say that's a very hard act to file after listening to Westcog. I feel like you just had the dog or kid show on in which have to equal it, and we're not going to. So just briefly, some of you've heard this before. This started from an F&B project where I was just looking at all of the boards, commissions, grants, organizations, sub-projects, and who's responsible within the standing committees to look at them. I then foolishly decided that I was going to look at the definitions of the committees and realized, to put it politely, they were old, archaic, and totally out of touch. And in fact, when I read them to Kate Bush, her mouth dropped and hit the floor. An example that I keep on using is in Public Works. They were still responsible for examining our town incinerator, which was eliminated in the 1980s. And if you don't know where it was, take a look at the swap shop. So from there, I went to Seth and said, Houston, we have a problem. I read some of the other things there, and Seth, Frank, and I got together, and that's what initiated the resolve of Appendix B. There's an intro to this, and the intro says that there's basically 5 things that we did modifications. Sometimes we just did a change that reflects the actual practice over the last 20 years. So for the 20 years I've been on the RTM, over 3 moderators would say, is there any other committee that wants to report? Well, the current code says the only committees that can report are the ones assigned by rules. So that is now rewritten that any committee can report on any area. Another one was, at one time, maybe 40, 50 years ago, people could be on more than one committee. That hasn't been in existence. I spoke to Joe Michelli, who's been in government for over 40 years. That hasn't been in effect. So now we corrected that to reflect that you can only be on one RTM committee. The second part is we did changes just to clarify the prior code. As I mentioned, the descriptions of the standing committees were old, archaic, and simply incorrect. the second part about it is, and we do have, I miscounted last night, but we have 4 people that are on the rules committee here. And but we believe that the standing committees are the heart and soul of the RTM, and therefore we clarified their empowerment of existing rights. And then there's one part of it that was one code that was a little draconian, where the RTM rules committee could remove any sitting chair of any standing committee with or without cause. And there were 3 letters that I thought of when I read this, and that is no longer in the code. I do want to express that this is not the Jack Davis Frank Kemp document. This has gone through numerous iterations with 15 to 20 people who have contributed to it. And the document that you see here today has been approved by the TGSNA committee. It is the TGSNA committee's document. We're going to be seeking input on it, and then TGSNA will make the final decisions of what is presented to the rules committee, who's not voting on it. They're just voting to put it on the agenda. We're shooting for the April meeting. We have had some of this is just wordsmithing, but I'm going to apologize to Amy. I have an email that's sitting in my draft box that was supposed to be sent to you a couple of days ago, and F&B was dropped with a additional resolution that we'll be dealing with on the 17th. And unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of information. So for the last 3 or so days, myself, Jen Chinesky, and working with Tony Hemicki have been trying to put together the information so that I can explain what's going on. And so that email never got out. So I apologize. What the apology deals with is the planning and zoning definition of what we currently have in the proposed draft. The old draft said, the existing code says, operations of town planning, zoning, building inspection, and public housing programs, including adoption and enforcement of laws, rules, and regulations affecting the same, and all related matters of administration, personnel, and finance. Well, we don't have say over personnel and certain administration. And then we wrote something. Yeah, but I'm not interested in that, Frank. I'm going to go to what the new one.
That's me.
Oh, okay. That's even better. Sorry. So I got a comment from somebody who read that and read the new one and said, you know, perhaps we should rewrite that. And that's the one that I was going to send to you, which we still will take comment from this committee because it defines your committee. But the new verbiage is liaison with land use boards and commissions, the Darien Housing Authority, public housing programs, and operational departments, including but not limited to following, monitoring, reporting, and recommended on financial matters, planning and zoning fees, the adoptions of laws, rules, and regulations, the 10-year plan of conservation and development, affordable housing plans, and other related state reporting as appropriate. Now, the fees, as many of you know, if there's a change to the planning and zoning fees by state law, that has to be in statute. So your committee brings that forward to us. You guys already look at the financials of the building land use departments, but the financials also include should there be an acquisition of property. So typically on an acquisition of property, and I know this is recorded, but I won't admit that I said this. On an acquisition of property where there's a bond, F&B usually leads. Now, I know what I know, and I know what I don't know. But on some of these acquisitions, similar to when we purchased the Circle, and there's been several other ones, I would be foolish to lead instead of asking Amy to explain it in English so the rest of us can understand. And in that case, F&B would be secondary, even though on the scope it says we're first, because Amy will give a better definition of this than I could even try. So those things do flop back and forth, but financial matters also include, and sometimes I guess it's called the mandatory referral.
Mandatory referral, yeah.
Yeah. So there's something that'll be coming up, and actually F&B is not going to report on it because we think it's minimal, and this committee can deal with it much better than having F&B get in the way. So the other things that are of somewhat importance is that something we took out, we're adding back in. One of the phrases said, by the way, I'm going to go back to this and I'll show you on that. Since I had nothing to do one Sunday, what I did was for every one of those 5 issues that I mentioned before, under those categories, I identified the section and the page number in the 11 page. So you can read what sections changes reflected actual practice over the last 20 years or clarification only. Obviously, the descriptions were all in one place. Standing committees are empowered. So I did it for an outline so people can look and see why we categorized it. There were footnotes at the end that reference back to these so that if you're reading a new section, you can go, this is why we did it. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about is on page 9.
Jack, you may want to mention the role of the subcommittees and how the ability to form subcommittees has been.
I'll get there. I just want to mention one other thing. We had taken out each standing committee shall act only upon the affirmative vote of a majority of a quorum of the committee. And we're actually adding that back in. I didn't like, and the other person who mentioned this back to me, we don't like affirmative votes only because sometimes a committee will vote on a negative vote, not to carry something.
Yeah.
So the new one will read someplace in the neighborhood, each standing committee shall act upon the majority vote of its members. A minority report representing the views of those that did not agree with the majority should also be included in that report if applicable. And in fact, in the report that I'm going to be making on the change to the depreciation schedule, you will see a minority report. That's not a maybe. To me, minority reports are important to be issued and should always be there, even if it's just a slight comment that, they didn't agree with this or that. So that was one of the things that we are bringing back to add back in. This one, and some of you may be familiar with the public works going to the sidewalks and getting a lot of heat when they wanted to set up their own subcommittee, which they had the right to do. So now we're codifying that. And that section now reads, any standing committee may, on its own discretion, consider a report to the RTM upon any matter not referred to it, but within their purview of such standing committee. Hence, the ones that weren't assigned by rules can now report. The second part of that is any standing committee or the rules committee is authorized to establish a subcommittee or working group to conduct a study or analysis within their purview. So that says that if somebody wants to take a look at playgrounds, they can take a look. Now, we may not have the right to make that decision, but they could present it to the appropriate board. And I personally give credit to the Public Works, RTM Public Works, because they set up that committee, and some comments coming in from the Oxbridge parents did in fact have John Zagroski go and pick back up a sidewalk report that was done 10 years ago and take another look at it. And I think that's important type of actions that the RTM committees can do. So that's my basic overview of it. We are, I get to say how quickly you get it back because Frank's more generous than I am. We're asking to get comments back on this, and I'll send this out tonight to you, Amy, to be distributed to committee, the new definition. We're asking for comments back no later than Tuesday, the day after the RTM meeting, because we need to do the turnaround. If there's anything you have questions on, you can either call Frank or myself. We're available, or just copy it to Frank and myself, and then we'll consolidate, bring to TGS&A. I have been asked what is somebody on F&B doing, working on this, so I will answer that. TGS&A is the only standing committee of the RTM that has no budgetary responsibility. So since, sorry about that, but since a lot of this has to do with budgets and how we run our business, I was asked to assist Frank in this, and that's why I'm involved. So if anybody had any questions on that, that answers that. So
Can
go ahead.
I just have a question to make sure I understand what you're looking for. So, I mean, obviously this committee is not going to have a chance to give you their group input by Tuesday because we don't even have the language in front of us to give it to you now. So are you asking for if any individual member has any comments to just send it directly to you and Frank?
Yeah, me.
Yes. But we'll of course, share the information, and the objective is to get those comments in so that we can clear it at the next TGS&A meeting and bake, in effect, bake these comments into the cake.
Okay, so but each individual who has a comment should send it directly to you. You won't be getting a group position.
Right, correct. The only part of this that you do not have is the redefinition of planning, zoning, and housing, which we'll have out, and then we'll take obviously comments on that from anyone who wants to make a comment and modifications. And we've been pretty good that if somebody has suggestions, we put them in, especially from a committee who has a better idea of what they do than we do. But the rest of this, if you look at the right-hand side of the 11-page document, that is the language. And that's, other than a little bit of wordsmithing and maybe one or two things, that really isn't changing. So from that regard, you do have it. Please read it, and we'll take individual comments there. What we're trying to do is get as many ideas. I'm not asking for a sense of the meeting because I don't know who read it and who didn't. I know this has taken some time, and what I like to say is that this is something that should last us for another 20 years. It's not a Beaujolais. It's supposed to be a better wine. So while it may have taken some time, hopefully we're at the better wine quality. So, but yes, individuals, if you have any questions to do it, I'm not looking for a total committee because you don't have another meeting for a while. Right. So.
Okay. All right. Any questions for Jack or Frank on this while we have them here, and knowing that we'll have a chance to sort of look over the language and send them written comments later? Anyone?
And I apologize for the short notice, but our moderator wants this in April. And if we extended it, it's not happening until June or September because there's something called budget that starts to get in the way, which that
or so
turn it away around quickly.
Yeah.
I'll just say that obviously, Amy, like we look to you for your input, and whatever input that you have, I trust in your judgment that it would be sufficient. And as Jack said, it sounds like it's more like a refining of the wine versus creating it from the grape, so to say, like from the start, So thanks, Frank and Jack, for all that you do for getting this moving. And it sounds like a lot of work.
Agreed. Thank you very much.
No wine until it's time.
I don't know, with all
Who
this
is
talk,
that?
I'm gonna be bringing
Is
wine to
that
the
Gallo? Is that a Gallo lad?
If this doesn't get done, I'll be drinking something a little stronger than wine.
I'd just like to
Alright.
thank Jack for keeping this succinct.
All right.
Morgan, I still remember the phrase you say that I couldn't say at the Board of Ed anymore.
Exactly.
All right. All right. Well, I think that unless there's any other questions, I just have a couple other things I want to talk about with scheduling with the committee. So thank you, Jack and Frank and Morgan. Thanks for good to see you. Any other questions? Sorry, before I move on. I think we're good. Okay. Thanks. So I do want to check in with you all as far as what's happening next month. So, and this is just for scheduling our next meeting. We've got on the agenda, and I sent around to you all, that Jeremy will be coming in to talk about the planning and zoning and building department budgets. We are going to have a land acquisition matter that we're going to need to vote on. It's a small thing. I don't have the details on it. I'm not trying to be vague. I just know that it's small and has no financial implications. The other thing that's coming up is the POCD, the Plan of Conservation Development consultant, would like to meet with our committee. So it was suggested that they meet with us at that same meeting. It's expected that'll take probably 45 minutes to an hour. I'm a little worried about doing that because that means we're pretty much guaranteed to have at least an hour and a half meeting for our next meeting. And I know I have been trying to keep these closer to an hour. We're a little over an hour now. So I don't know if people are okay with that or if you'd rather have 2 meetings. So I just wanted to get a sense of where people feel about that. If
Yeah,
anyone has any thoughts.
I'd rather knock it out in one meeting.
Okay,
One meeting.
1 meeting. Okay. One.
Uno.
All right.
Hold on. Our next meeting is scheduled for what day again, Amy?
It's April 17th at 7 p.m. Is that right?
Okay.
Wait, April, hold on. Don't wait.
That's
Yeah,
right. That's right. That's the
right.
right
Yeah.
date.
Okay, yeah,
So
17th.
I will be dialed in. I'll be out of the country that week, but I
Okay.
can dial in.
Okay. All right, well, as long as everyone's okay with that, we'll plan to do it all in one meeting, but like I said, just bring some water. It'll be a longer one. And we will get
That
some.
is Darien school break week. I don't know if that impacts anybody.
All right, well, I'll send around after this meeting a request for attendance. I know when I had asked people to sort of tell me ahead of time, and I've only gotten one person who said they definitely couldn't come. So I'll send around just a request to confirm what our attendance will be. What was I going to say? But to make sure if we need to move, we can, and we will get some communication from the POCD consultant at least a week ahead in advance of our meeting with some discussion points and possibly some comments to send back to him so he can focus his discussion with us. Okay. All right. Any other questions or things that anyone else wanted to address before we log off? All right.
Jamie,
I will take a motion to adjourn.
so moved.
All right.
Second.
Got a second from Dan. All right. We're all set.
Good night,
Thank you
everyone.
all so much for joining. I appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.